Well, hi, everyone. It's Sister Elizabeth, and you are listening to In the Company of Charity, the podcast of the Daughters of Charity. And I am in the company today in an interview with Trinh Truong, who is a young woman I met here in Utica, really fascinating young woman. But I am also, of course, joined by my co-host, Sister Liz Schoberg. How are you doing today, Sister Liz?
I am great. So happy to be here.
Well, it's always happy to have you. It's great. It's great. Best co-host ever.
I mean,
yeah,
we haven't traded each other out at this point, so that's...
No, we haven't.
We're doing okay.
So that's good. We are. But today we have an episode. It's quite remarkable young woman that I met here in Utica who has over time experienced and a kind of a shift in her life. She is a young woman from Vietnam, came here in the early 2000s with her mom. So she grew up, she was about 3 when she arrived here as a refugee. And her story is just very profound, I think, in ways to see this young woman come from pretty, a difficult situation, but then growing into the story as time went on in her own life, and her mother sharing parts of that story with her, and her understanding her place in the family of this tragedies that happened in her family during the Vietnam War, and things that happened in her family that she'll talk about. Really remarkable how she's processed it, but as well as how she's allowed it to kind of inform the way she makes decisions now in her adult life and the choices that she's making.
Very, very impressed by her. And I think that she has a tremendous depth of character. And, I think when we look back at historical events, so many of us are far removed from that experience. But then, here's a person who in a way was removed from it too, as someone who came when they were 3 years old. But that slow discovering of who I am, really, and her family situation and the things that her parents had to struggle through, and her other family members. It's just such a fascinating case study in the whole refugee situation, especially in the context of the Vietnamese refugees. I'm very excited for people to hear this episode. I think it is a deep dive into that first person experience. And
and if anyone listening wants to send a message to Trinh, email us at the company of charity @gmail.com, and we'll make sure she gets the message. So welcome, Trinh, to In the Company of Charity.
Thank you, Sister Elizabeth. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and so just tell us about yourself, what you want us to know about your life coming here as a refugee, how that's informed who you are now.
I was resettled in 2001 from Vietnam with my mother, so that was about 18 years ago. And something that I always find very funny when people meet me is like, oh, you're a refugee, your English is so good. And I always say, well, I hope so. I went through the entire public education system here in the United States in Utica.
That's a great answer.
Yeah. We were resettled because of political persecution and also through a family reunification program.
So stop there just for a second, because when you say that you were resettled from Vietnam in 2001, correct? I would bet most of our listeners are thinking, really? We're still resettling?
Yeah.
People from Vietnam? I mean, we thought that was done a long time ago. So I think it helps. It helps me to realize one thing I've learned in the work that I've been doing here in Utica with refugees is that, our image that people flee their country, they go to another country, and within a short period of time, they get whisked off to their resettlement country.
Right.
And that obviously is not the case. So I just kind of wanted to bring that up. I find that really fascinating. So tell us a little bit more about that's been like for you.
Yeah. So I'm going to get a little bit into sort of my whole family's resettlement story, because that has been fascinating for me to kind of unearth, surprisingly enough, only over the past few years of my adult life. And so, when I was growing up, I knew that we were refugees, but I didn't really know what the reason was or sort of the significance of that, because everyone else on my block on Elm Street and everyone else I went to school with too, a lot of people were immigrants and refugees. But apparently, and the story's changed a few times, but I think I finally got the true version, was that my grandfather worked for the CIA and was pretty high up in the South Vietnamese administration. So my family was staunchly like anti-communist, and my grandmother was a democratic activist, so she would hold salons in Saigon sort of preaching about, why we should be supporting the democratic effort in the South, while my grandfather was, doing like CIA intelligence stuff, at the Capitol. And so my mom was the youngest of 9, and she was born in 74, which is 1 year before the Vietnam War ended for Vietnamese people. So the real end of the war.
Right.
Americans think that the war ended when we pulled out. Well, a lot of stuff happened after that.
Exactly, yeah.
So after the war ended, the communists won, the North won, and my family lost everything. And then they were sent to concentration camps, basically, like labor camps where there was a lot of disease, people were worked to death, people starved to death, and for some, graceful reason, my mom was spared. So she was only a baby, and when my whole family, went to turn themselves into these re-education centers, as they were formerly known, some Viet Cong officer looked at her and was like, he probably thought to himself, well, if this baby goes, then they're not going to make it out. So she was separated from her family for 9 years while they were in those camps. Wow. Raised by some distant relative or friend or family member. And so, when everyone got out, that puts us chronologically in the mid-1980s. And even then, my grandfather was eligible for refugee resettlement, and our whole family was, but decided not to take it because he was just so skeptical of any government at that time. And so he waited until his friend and colleague was resettled in California, and they mailed each other letters and such, and he reassured my grandfather, no, this refugee resettlement scheme is actually real, they'll give you a new life in America, this is not a trick. And so by the time that my grandparents filed paperwork, it took years and years, they finally made it to America in 1994 in Utica with my grandfather. So it was my grandfather, my grandmother, and uncle. And then...
So that was a full 20 years
yeah.
later for them. That was the beginning of your family being resettled.
Right, after the war ended, 20 years.
Yeah.
And then my mom and I joined in 2001, so that's 7 years later.
Wow.
And so we were, I think, one of the last groups of Vietnamese refugees to be officially resettled with refugee status. Mm-hmm. And so our trajectory has been very different than what I think a lot of people know in their imagination as, the Vietnamese boat people.
Right, right.
Which, those were a significant group, and those waves of refugees came more or less immediately after the fall of Saigon in 75, 85. And what's very fascinating that I only learned this past winter when I was visiting family in Vietnam was that my whole family was originally supposed to be airlifted right before Saigon fell. Like everyone was on the roof of what is now known as Independence Palace, which is the main government headquarters in Saigon. Mm-hmm. But one of my grandfather's, I think, uncles was late, and we couldn't leave the whole family. And so because of my one late uncle, my family, we joke now and say that, we're deathly late.
Right.
Because of him, they...
a macabre joke, but...
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's part of the story that you tell. It's amazing.
Yeah. And so the American tradition of refugee resettlement really came out of these conflicts in not only Vietnam, but Laos and Cambodia in the 70s and 80s. And I was doing some research for a paper that I was writing while I was finishing my studies in May, and it turns out that we like to think and romanticize and say, oh, we welcome those Southeast Asians with open arms. That wasn't true. Mm-hmm. American public opinion at the time of the beginning of the refugee resettlement program was about 50-50, like more or less it is today.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think, obviously as time goes on and people adapt and assimilate, we forget what it was like.
Right.
And again, you're right, we remember Vietnamese boat people. It's kind of like we also remember Lost Boys of the Sudan. So we think only child soldiers from Sudan have been resettled. And we have kind of a good feeling about that in one way, like we rescued these poor people. But on the other hand, we don't really understand what the plight was in the countries where they were. So that, yes, there are, Sudanese lost boys, and there were people, but there were also Vietnamese people who are left behind.
Yes.
In ways, and that that itself was a struggle. I mean, even the timeline, you're saying your mother lived her whole life in refuge in Vietnam until she was able to be resettled here. And that resettlement becomes that process of leaving the place of persecution that will never allow you to live your life freely, to then have to go someplace that may or may not really want you there. And so to say that you're being resettled in 2001 is like, well, like I said before, we thought this was all over. And so all of our feelings about it are also over, because many of us now are older and we don't have the same memories of it. You know, as the generations change, the memories of what that hostility was sometimes can disappear with it. But we see it crop up again in the next wave of refugees. You've been to college, so tell us a little bit about that. So you're growing up, you're in school, you're seeing what's going on around you, you're living your life. I'm sure that your family wants you to just live a good life. That's what they've struggled to help you as a child in the family. They're all adults now when they get here. So what's that been like for you? And how does it inform what you do now?
So that's those are big questions, and there's things that I still think about. So I just graduated from Yale in May, which was probably the biggest privilege of my entire life.
That's fabulous. Good for you. Congratulations.
Thank you. I remember when I was really young, I was probably like 6 or 7 or 8, and my mom looked at me and she very sternly said, we're living in poverty, and if you don't go to school and get an education, we're going to be poor for the rest of our lives, and you're going to be poor for the rest of your life. And that's a lot for a 6, 7, 8-year-old to hear.
It certainly is.
So that was sort of the age that I decided that, I set goals, and I said, well, I want to graduate, valedictorian of my high school class, 18 years later, and I want to go to an Ivy League school, which in retrospect was super crazy because I barely had an understanding of what those two things meant, but knew that I wanted them. So even though I didn't have people who looked like me and direct role models, I sort of had a community of teachers who really believed in me and really adored me and really was thinking about my future long term for me, which is not what my mom was there to do, raising me as a single mom who worked 40 to 60-hour weeks in a greenhouse, just trying to make ends meet. And so like graduating from Yale was the realization of a dream almost 2 decades in the making.
That's amazing.
I think as I sort of came into a young adult, I became really involved in activism and was really sort of at the forefront of the local Occupy Utica movement when I was 13 years old, just protesting inequality and thinking about, democracy and the kind of community and society that we wanted to live in. So from there, I got super involved in the New York Civil Liberties Union and was like the youngest person on their board at age 13, which in retrospect was absolutely absurd and awesome at the same time. And I've done a lot of work on public education issues in high school and sort of lobbied with local stakeholders to change the way that they funded public schools. And basically, to summarize, it was just, hey, like we are high needs, like students of color, immigrants, refugees, dealing with like generational poverty and all these things, and you should give us more money because more robust education leads to more opportunities. And it was really in high school that I began to have more of an awareness of like what my positionality in society is, and sort of thinking about my identity as a refugee woman, a poor woman, a woman of color, and sort of thinking about the lack of opportunities that I had by nature of, beginning a new life. And, I did feel these things when I was growing up, even when I was in elementary school and middle school. Like my friends were doing like Pop Warner cheerleading and doing ballet lessons, and they had the parents who could have the disposable income to pay for these things and to shuttle them around the city. And I didn't really have that until I was in high school, and I met this really great woman who I call my fairy godmother, Diane Barry, who, like financially supported me in ways that, my mom couldn't, and drove me around the city as, like a retired librarian with no family, but just cats.
Right.
And, I think
Thank God for fairy godmothers.
Right.
But the piece of that is, thank God for fairy godmothers. All of us need to be aware in our community and step up when we see other people struggling. But the fact that coming to the United States, working hard, doesn't mean you're going to get out of poverty and that your family is going to be lifted up. And that I think that's a really important message also, because I think we have the impression that, someone who's doing well means that that they're going to be able to give their children everything. And if you're in the public school setting, you should be, getting what everyone else is getting. And it's really not all fair, and it's not all equal by any means. No. And so opportunity comes not just because you do well, but because the whole community does well. That we all need to step up and help. So go on. So your fairy godmother comes. Do you become the cheerleader? What happens?
No.
I
became
I was gonna say, knowing you now for this short time, I can't imagine it was cheerleading you went to. But
I did do golf and tennis, which is really
nothing
funny.
wrong with cheerleaders, though. Anybody listening who is a cheerleader, good for you.
But to build on what you just said, I think that one of the worst myths that people tell themselves in America is, the harder you work, the luckier you get, which I think like FDR said or something like that, because something that I always like to emphasize is that I'm so successful because I was really lucky. Like so many things went right in my life, and also by function of, like being like when I was a little kid, I was, cute little precocious Asian girl who wasn't experiencing like anti-Black racism, which we all now know is sort of a driving force behind like the school to prison pipeline and sort of like suspension rates and stuff. And, I think as refugees, so much of your success is contingent on how well you do in public school here.
Yes,
because that really,
been seeing that a lot. Yeah.
And that really is sort of the stepping stone to like, the trajectory of more or less the rest of your life here in America. And so that's something that I really, really want to emphasize. But after I graduated from high school, I went to Yale, and the question was, like, who am I going to become? What am I going to do? And something that I've always been driven by is sort of a sense of purpose and obligation. And I think I learned that by understanding that, the people who helped me in Utica were people from different walks of life who had purpose and decided that they wanted to be obligated to help refugees and to help me. And so, for the first few years, I kind of just did a variety of things and studied literature and philosophy. And in my junior and senior years, I really decided that, where else to go but back home. And so the summer after my freshman year, I came back to Utica to do an internship with the refugee center. And I was a resettlement intern. And what was very peculiar about that summer was that in some ways I felt like my life was coming full circle and that my purpose was becoming clearer. And so that summer, for the first time in dozens of years, there was a family of Vietnamese people coming in to be resettled as refugees.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. And this was, now this was like 5 years ago or something 4 or 5 years ago. But it was a family of Vietnamese Cambodians. And, to think about how history ebbs and flows, they were Vietnamese folks who were living on the border of Vietnam and Cambodia. And Cambodians sometimes really struggle with what to think of Vietnamese people. So after, Pol Pot ascended to power and, started a genocide in which he thought he was going to create a socialist utopia, like I think 6 or 7 million Cambodians died. And so, and what ended all of that in 1979 was when the Viet Cong came in and invaded Cambodia and it overthrew him from power. And so because of that portion of history, a lot of Cambodians see Vietnamese people as the other. And not only the other, but as the other who came in and took over their country and threatened their sovereignty.
Right.
And so these folks, this family, was politically persecuted. And I don't know how, because I'm not sure there's any, active UNHCR, United Nations Commissioner for High Commissioner for Refugees operating in the Southeast Asia in that area. But somehow they were able to be processed for refugee resettlement. And, this family came in and actually lived right on this block. And the language was sort of a barrier because the main point person in the family spoke Vietnamese, but not a lot of it. And I speak Vietnamese, but not advanced enough. And so we're putting together our piecemeal Vietnamese and really working together to kind of welcome them here to Utica. And something that I was really proud that I was able to do and felt really satisfied about was that I had the time and the energy, since I was just an intern with not too much work to do, I got to, bring them to the local temple, and I got to bring them to the local Cambodian market so that they could make their own community connections.
Yeah, that's
and
great. Yeah.
What was so heartwarming for me was that the Cambodian community welcomed them with open arms and gave them furniture and helped them, really find their bearings here in Utica. And so after that, I was like, I think refugee resettlement, refugee integration is sort of the academic issue that, I really want to study and the work that I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so the rest of my time spent at Yale was spent doing a lot of activism around advocating for more refugee resettlement and traveling to just a bunch of countries around the world, trying to understand how communities really build and forge welcome.
Mm-hmm.
So I was, doing the field work and traveling and interacting with people, but also studying those issues from like a legal and policy-based focus, and also dabbling in like philosophy and a lot of first questions about, like, are humans naturally welcoming or unwelcoming, or, what does it mean when humans come together and agree to like be in a government and agree to do these things, and what obligations and responsibilities stem from that.
Wow, that's pretty fascinating to see where I think that again, that process of your own awakening to what issues are out there. And you call yourself lucky. In a church tradition, we would say you were blessed. It's probably the prayers of many, many people.
Yes.
But also luck. I mean, luck in that other people respond to either a call from God to do something, or they see an oppression, they see something in front of them, and they're able to react to it. So there's all kinds of factors, and those can impact people one way or another. And so to hear your story, and as I said when we first met, in just the evolution of the way you talk about not just yourself but the work that you do is so clearly comes out of an empathy.
Yes.
And so it can. I think there's a lot of the academics. You went to Yale and you did a lot of study, but I also get from you a sense of the empathy, the understanding that while your story might be different, every refugee's story is different.
Yes.
And each refugee is at some point dependent on the goodwill of others,
Yeah.
but then also the goodwill within their own family and their own ability to move forward. Not every refugee does as well as you're doing. Not every refugee is going to be able to fulfill all their dreams. But that the whole point to resettlement, the whole point to refugee resettlement is that those dreams are still possible, that nobody is just stuck in we hope that people just aren't stuck in the oppression that's brought them to a refugee camp, and that's the end of the story. But that we as people, we as human beings, should always be reaching out and trying to find that way to open the path for others' dreams, so that oppression ends and the ability for us to rise above it begins. Yeah. So now you've graduated from Yale. You're here back in Utica. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you mention, evolution and sort of the way that I have evolved to understand myself and sort of the work that I do, because in the past few years, a consciousness has sort of developed in this country and within my own brain about the intersection between refugee resettlement, which is understood as, like the UNHCR, the United Nations, goes to a refugee camp in a foreign country and processes folks and clears them after years and years and years to come to the United States to start a new life.
Right.
So there's been an intersection between how we understand that and how we understand asylum and different forms of immigration that are crucially related. Mm-hmm. And by asylum, I mean sort of what's going on right now at the southern border, which is folks mainly coming from Central America and the Northern Triangle countries like Honduras and El Salvador, which are especially plagued with high levels of violence and unsafety. And so, the asylum process is when someone presents themselves at a port of entry in the United States and crosses over and sits in waiting for a period of time, which can be very short and right now is very long, and undergoes case review to see if they are eligible to get asylum status, which basically is another way to say refugee status, but just through a different way. Mm-hmm. And so, I've been thinking a lot about what it means to belong in this country and what it means to be precarious in this country, and sort of what drives people to come to America and to walk thousands of miles or to languish in a refugee camp for 10, 20 years sometimes.
Right.
And so basically, you know, a lot of people who are desperate enough to present themselves at a port of entry and to make a very dangerous journey, you know, across the Rio Grande River, across the border, are fleeing the same things that, you know, refugees who are resettled the traditional way are facing. So that's violence and persecution and natural disasters. And so my work in the last few years has really intersected with the immigration movement in the U.S. that is seeking more legal pathways for individuals who are already here in the United States to get formal status.
Right.
And so to be clear, you know, I'm talking about undocumented folks here in the United States and how we can help them get green cards and citizenship and other forms of legal residency and visas.
Right, and that really does, as you're saying, we're not talking about saying everyone comes in, we're going to have this, you know, completely open border and people are just going to be able to come in. That's what scares people.
Right.
We're talking about, one, using the already internationally recognized legal structures that allow people to present themselves, or that give everyone the right to present themselves and to show or to be able to prove, in whatever way people can do that, a credible fear.
Yes.
That they are being persecuted. And so in some ways I think the struggle becomes our border, the border of a country that has been for years legally resettling people from far and wide, right? Africa, Asia, you know, former Soviet Union countries. Now we're talking about the process, so we're a resettlement country that is resettling people who have already proven a credible fear and have proven themselves to be refugees, but they've been in another country. Their asylum seeking happened in Thailand,
yes,
or it happened in Burundi, or it happened in Kenya, it happened somewhere else. Those countries saw the trauma, know the violence and accepted their refugee status, and then start the resettlement process. This process is different. At our border, we're saying we are the host country. We are the country in which people are arriving to prove that they have a credible fear of being persecuted, killed, that their family is not safe where they are. So I think people don't understand that we're still talking about a legal process here, and that yes, are there some people who are trying to get over the border without documents? They're still afraid, but they realize, I think much the way you spoke in the beginning about your own grandfather who didn't trust.
Yes.
Why would you trust a government, any
Yes.
government, when every government you've had in your own country has been corrupt and violent and oppressive? Why trust any government? And why trust a government that changes as much as ours has in relation to the way we see refugees? So,
right. And I think it's important to harp on the fact that immigration is very complicated.
Yeah.
And so this summer I have been doing some work with local undocumented dairy and farm workers. Mm-hmm. And something that I've come to realize, and you know, as I'm evolving in the way that I understand issues, is that there are multiple reasons why people leave their countries. And I think, you know, like a better life is the common phrase that you hear associated with refugees and immigrants. And that's true. And yes, like some people do come to America because they want more economic opportunities so that their kids are not starving.
Right.
But also, more often than not, that motivation intersects and overlaps with the fact that they might be coming from a country like Honduras, which has one of the highest like murder rates per capita in the world.
Right.
And so, you know, a lot of these folks are here, and unfortunately, not even 10, 15 minutes outside of Utica, you know, these people are living in trailers that are poorly insulated, don't have air conditioning, sometimes with really young children who have also made the journey. Mm-hmm. And, you know, they're working on farms, and unfortunately, a lot of them are sort of at the whim of the farmer they're working for.
Right.
There are good farmers who treat their workers well, and there are farmers who do not. And, you know, the rural areas in upstate New York are very isolated, and it's very hard to have a social life or have a sense of community when people don't have vehicles or transportation. They're not visible, so it's not like we see these people in our everyday lives. But also, I've also learned that, you know, like some students that I went to high school with, my colleagues were undocumented, and, I'm only learning about this because there wasn't really a dialogue or a way to talk about those issues in the past. And so there's a lot of work to be done in these communities, and so much of it is know your rights education and talking with parents and, saying like, hey, like ICE might be doing raids in Utica in the next coming months as immigration enforcement becomes more aggressive. And so you need to have an emergency preparedness plan in case ICE comes and picks you up and throws you away in a jail for who knows how long. Right. And so you need to sign these papers that give decision-making power to one of your friends or relatives so that other people can come pick your kids up from school if they take you at your job or in the middle of the day. And it means talking to workers and employers and saying, hey, are you prepared for an ICE workplace raid? Right. This is what you should do. And it means like handing out know your rights cards to local like Latinx businesses that have instructions in English and Spanish on what to do if they're approached by an ICE agent or asked about their status. And so that's the direct work that's been going on for me in these communities. But the other facet of it, the other half of it, is working with people who are not directly affected but want to be allies. Right. And want to think about what they can do within their own families and congregations and communities to protect the rights of undocumented immigrants.
Yeah. So where do you go from here? What's next in this for you?
Yeah, and so I guess to tie everything into sort of what I'm doing in the past, or in the future, excuse me, is that, people assume that once refugees come here, they're here forever. That's not true. So when refugees come to the United States, they have this really liminal refugee status for about a year, and then usually, and there's a lot of help for this at our local agency, they get green cards, which are legal permanent resident cards that basically don't give you citizenship, but you're able to live here indefinitely.
Right.
And so something that has been really complicated is that refugees with green cards have been deported increasingly over the past few years that the Trump administration has been in power. Mm-hmm. And so the way that goes is that in 1996, Bill Clinton passed this law that changed the way that we understood immigration. I forget exactly what it stands for, but it's commonly known as the Era Law of 1996. And it created this class of aggravated felony. And what an aggravated felon does is make someone deportable by nature of a specific crime that they've committed.
Okay. Now, even if they have a green
even
card.
If they are here on refugee status.
Okay.
And the complicated thing about an aggravated felony is that it's very broad. So homicide is an aggravated felony, but also like different levels of like larceny and even trespassing in some cases combined with another infraction. And so, it's a really broad spectrum of things that an individual could be deported for. And the complicated thing is that refugees are never supposed to be deported, period.
Right.
There's an article in the United Nations Refugee Convention that is called non-refoulement. And basically what that means is that someone should never be returned to a country where they might be facing danger.
Right.
And so a lot of Southeast Asian refugees, particularly in the 70s and 80s, were either resettled here as very, very young children, like me when I was 3, or were basically, they were born in refugee camps and never had been in their native countries.
Right.
And so a lot of previous administrations understood that Southeast Asian refugees and other groups of refugees who have committed crimes are a very delicate group. They're very vulnerable. And so, there are not a lot of us in the United States compared to other ethnic groups.
Right.
And so, he is targeting these folks for deportation, and I think that the deportation should be stopped. And during my time at Yale, I had the opportunity to go to Cambodia to meet some of these folks who have been deported and to be thinking about who is helping them readjust to life in Cambodia. I mean,
which many of them have never lived in Cambodia.
Right.
They are Cambodian by nationality.
Yes.
Yeah. But they may have been born in a refugee camp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of these folks had never been to Cambodia, had never stepped foot there, and were being deported there, but were born in like Thai refugee camps. And so what is really, there's a cruel irony to all this, which is that these people are essentially refugees for a second time.
Yeah, exactly.
So, they need to go start a new life again in the middle of their natural human life at like late 30 or like 40 years old. And but what is fascinating is that civil society agencies have formed that are basically doing what refugee resettlement agencies are doing here in the U.S.
Wow.
So, there are groups of concerned citizens who have come together in Cambodia, who are native Cambodian, but also American immigrants who are doing work in Cambodia, who are helping these folks learn English, get their learn Khmer, get their paperwork, find a job, find housing, and there's a little community of these deportees in Cambodia, and the locals call them Khamericans.
Wow.
Which is a portmanteau of Khmer and American.
American, right.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's who you're going to work with.
Yeah.
So you leave September
30th.
30th.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I'm really interested in sort of there's a string that ties all of my research and all of my extracurricular community activities together, and that's sort of the question of, how do people create welcome and belonging in spite of all of these bad circumstances and all these limitations and challenges.
Wow, it's incredibly fascinating. And I'm also realizing, when we do a podcast, when it actually gets aired is going to be different. So I feel very blessed and lucky to have met you right now, because we only have like a month and a half from the time I met you to when you're going to be leaving. But I just want to say real quick, we were, as we talk about being lucky and blessed, you and I had a conversation about Saint Josephine Bakita, who is a saint who lived in Sudan and is the patron saint of refugee issues and human trafficking, which we know is a huge issue around the world. And so we, kind of ask her blessing. I ask her blessing on you in the continuation of your work. And I learned that the word Bakita in Arabic, which is how she was named, means lucky or blessed. So I think that with her intercession, we can keep the luck and the blessings flowing through the work that you're doing and the continued work. No matter what happens in our government, there are still people in this country that need to be resettled well. And that process takes the whole community to do that.
Well, thank you for your blessings, Sister Elizabeth. My mom has been, pretty happy. The other day she asked me, like, oh, what have you been up to? I'm like, oh, I'm actually working with the church community to think about, like immigrants and refugees. And I've been hanging out with Sister Elizabeth and Sister Michelle. And so she's kind of happy that I've, have wandered and found myself back
at the church.
At the church with the Catholics and other folks in the interfaith community.
Yeah, so we're pretty cool to hang out with.
Oh, absolutely.
Catholics. Yeah, it's good for you to come back.
And it's good conversation, too.
It has been very good conversations, So that's a topic off the podcast. But everyone listening, pray for Trinh.
Thank you.
Ask Saint Bakita to continue to bless her.
This has been In the Company of Charity podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.